So I imagine that many of you are dealing with worry, with boredom during this time when we're isolated from one another during the early outbreak of this coronavirus. And for that reason, I'm going to be dealing today with a strategy, a particular strategy from early Buddhism that we can use to overcome issues of worry, stress, and boredom. But it doesn't only apply to the coronavirus. It applies to daily life even in normal times, more normal times. So whether or not we're in the coronavirus when you're watching this video, I think it might be helpful. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So, worry, stress, boredom, these are related kinds of states, really. They tend to sort of oscillate between each other. And the Buddha has a strategy that we can use, and we should generally use in daily life, which is one of focusing on the present. Now, we may have heard that kind of teaching if we've learned about mindfulness meditation, where generally in mindfulness meditation we're told to stay within the present. But this comes originally from early Buddhist teachings. There's several places we can find these kinds of teachings, but one sutta in particular that I will quote right now, just to give you a flavor of what it was like, of how it was spoken of in the early days. So the Buddha says, don't run back to the past. Don't hope for the future. What's past is left behind. The future has not arrived. And phenomena in the present are clearly seen in every case. Knowing this, foster it, unfaltering, unshakable. Today's the day to keenly work. Who knows, tomorrow may bring death. For there is no bargain to be struck with death and his mighty hordes. Now, warfare is sometimes described as months of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Now, we aren't literally in a war right now, fortunately, except really for those few of us who are on the front lines in hospitals, who are healthcare workers and in difficult places in the world right now. Jobs like that, positions like that may be akin to warfare, really. But for the rest of us, it's a relatively benign kind of time, for the most part. What we have to deal with are worries, stresses that come from the possibility of infection, of doing what we can in our daily life to avoid infection. Or if we're looking at a broader scale, we, in our ordinary life, deal with the ordinary worries of making money, of keeping a family, of keeping our jobs. Many, many different ways that we stress and worry in ordinary life. First, we'll deal with worries, stress, at times panic that we might feel. It's important, before I get to how we might deal with it, it's important to keep in mind that a certain amount of worry is produced by public officials, by the news media. We can say under certain circumstances, it's done to, let's say, sell newspapers or get eyeballs onto video screens. But in this kind of situation where we're in right now, having to deal with the coronavirus, it's actually doing us a public service, because if we aren't a little bit worried, we're not likely to take it seriously enough. And we know that the things that we're supposed to do, such as washing our hands, such as self-isolating, these are difficult things to do, things that we wouldn't ordinarily want to do. And by worrying us a little bit, by taking us out of our ordinary place, they're going to make it more likely that we actually do the things that we need to do. The way that a doctor would give you a stern talking to about some aspect of your lifestyle, perhaps, and try to get you a little worried so that you might change something that's really not skillful that you're doing. So we have to keep that in mind. A certain amount of worry is perfectly healthy in this kind of circumstance, and in our ordinary lives, a certain amount of worry, as long as it's kept within bounds, is healthy, or can be healthy. The problem is that for so many of us, so much of the time, we spend too much time worrying. We spend too much time being stressed, and we get too stressed about things. And that's when it can become a problem. And then it can help to remind ourselves about the teaching that I just read from early Buddhism. For example, that we not run back to the past. Oftentimes in our worries, in our stresses, we will run back to the past. We will think of the way things were before, whatever the stage may be that we're in right now. We will often hold it in too high of a regard. We will tend to look upon it with somewhat rosy-eyed glasses. We may think, oh, things were much better back then. Think of how bad they are right now. And the Buddha cautions us against doing this kind of thing. And as the sutta goes on, the Buddha then describes what running back into the past really means. And for him, it means basically grasping at an idea of yourself having been in the past. Thinking, oh, I had such and such a form, I had such and such feelings, I had such and such experiences, perceptions, and so on. That is to say, that we think of ourselves in the past as perhaps, it might be being healthier, it might be being stronger, it might be having more pleasant kinds of experiences than we're having now. Perhaps we could, let's say, go out to a restaurant in the past. We can't right now, as the way things are right now, for many of us anyhow. Again, even if we're not talking about this kind of circumstance, we do this all the time. We run back into the past and think, oh, weren't things better back then? And this, the Buddha says, basically, is not a helpful way of looking at things. It's not accurate oftentimes, and it's not helpful. Now, it is, of course, good to look upon the past as a place of learning. We can learn from mistakes that we may have made, or that other people may have made. We can look upon the past perhaps even as a source of regret, that things that we've done wrong, but not as a source, not as something to dwell upon, as simply something to learn from and move forward from. And so in this way, we can see that looking back into the past, especially grasping at things that have gone, the past is not going to come back, grasping at things that have gone is simply going to be another source of suffering for us right now. And the future is uncertain. Indeed, even the past, in a certain sense, is uncertain in the way that we misremember the past so much of the time. We're not necessarily aware of this, of course, because we don't see our own misrememberings as they are, most of the time. But in fact, we often do misremember the past, looking at it as either too good or too bad. This is more clear with the future. The future is completely uncertain. We really do not know what the future will bring. That's something that may seem like a bad kind of thing right now may turn out, for all we know, to be good. So, for example, it might be that we're losing a job right now. That, of course, is very sad. It's the sort of thing that perhaps we would prefer not happen. But we really don't know how that's going to play out in the future. It might be that by losing a job, we become more in tune with what we really like to do. And so we change careers and indeed get a better job for ourselves in the longer term. So it may be that a certain disruption right now is for our long-term benefit. It's hard to know. Indeed, it's impossible to know for sure. And insofar as we cling to the future, which oftentimes we do, we cling to an idealized idea of our own future, we're going to oftentimes be left clinging to fantasies, because futures, ideas of the future, possible futures for ourselves, they evaporate with the times. That's just the way things are. And as a result, we can often be left holding a kind of a smoke that just dissipates into the ether, as opposed to focusing on what we really can change, which is something right now. The only thing that really matters is this present that we're in. The place at which we can act, the place at which we can make a difference, or any difference that can be made now, can be made in the present. And so it's good to keep that in mind, that insofar as we're besieged by worries and stress, it may be that we'll find, if we sit quietly and investigate, that those worries, those stresses, are due to our minds being out of the present, being beset with concerns about a future that perhaps is evaporating, that we're in danger of losing, a kind of an illusory future. Or we may be beset by regrets or worries about a past which we cannot change anymore. These are obviously the sorts of things that are not helpful. They're helpful in a small degree to be aware of the past and sort of be able to change, and to be aware of potential futures so that we can act right now to make them, the better ones, come true. But apart from that, obsessing about past and future is simply not useful. And so a practice of focusing on the present is one that can take us out of these kinds of non-useful, of useless kinds of worries and stresses. Now, the second problem for many of us is the problem of dealing with boredom. And this may indeed be a bigger problem because it takes up a larger period of time in our lives, oftentimes for many of us. Particularly, let's say, if we are quarantined, if we're told to stay indoors, if we're told to not interact with one another, we may be faced with long periods of boredom. And in periods like that, we may have the habit of sort of picking at mental scabs of one kind or another. That is to say, getting ourselves into unskillful mental habits that arise because we just have so much time on our hands that the mind doesn't really know what to do with itself. And meditation here can be a source of a solution to this problem, as with many other things, because meditation, calming meditation, let's say, that is focusing on the breath, for example, it can be seen, at least in part, as a practice of dealing with boredom. Because one of the things that one faces, that we all face when seated in meditation, is this monkey mind that arises when nothing's happening, quote unquote, when it seems as though we're not being entertained by the world. Our ordinary way of being is to want to be entertained all the time. And so the mind flits from one thing to another. If we're caught in a period of our lives where not much is happening, we again may try to entertain ourselves by taking us to this place and that place. By sitting down in meditation, we're forcing ourselves not to do that. And so simply by practicing meditation, we can become more, shall we say, familiar with boredom. And what is the antidote to this boredom? Once again, it has to do, at least it can be seen, one of the ways we can get at it is by understanding this as a focus on the present, where what we want to do is to really inhabit this present moment. And one of the ways that inhabiting can help us overcome boredom is by trying to foster curiosity. Curiosity is kind of an antidote to boredom. So if we can become curious about this present moment that we're inhabiting, then that curiosity can take on a life of its own, and then we'll find ourselves beyond boredom. So, for example, we can investigate within ourselves while we're seated in meditation, or indeed in any part of our lives, and just figure out where the boredom is coming from. How does it manifest itself? How does it manifest itself in our minds? What is the feeling of the mind when it's bored? What happens? Where does this boredom seem to arise from, and what does it seem to produce? What seems to come out of it? Or where do we find it in the body? Investigating the body is very popular nowadays in meditation. I think it's a very useful kind of practice. And once again, we can look at boredom where it seems to manifest within us, bodily, that is to say, what kind of feelings are associated with it, what kind of bodily stresses, pains, discomforts, or anything, frankly. And this strategy of investigation or curiosity is actually one of the 7 factors of awakening, the second of the 7 factors of awakening. I did a video on the 7 factors of awakening. I'll put a link to it down below in the show notes if you want to hear more about these factors of awakening. But the second one is essentially curiosity that arises out of mindfulness. So we get ourselves into a mindful state, and then we become curious about what arises. And one of the things that as we see, can arise is a feeling of boredom, a feeling of wanting to do something else, which can manifest as restlessness, which is something that I think any of us who have meditated have felt from time to time. We can also look at boredom from the point of view of the First Noble Truth. And this is, again, a present, staying with the present moment. We can see it right now as a manifestation of the First Noble Truth. That is, the truth of what's known in Pali as dukkha, or suffering, or perhaps more accurately as unsatisfactoriness, that life is not ever completely satisfactory, because even the best states will, that is to say, the most pleasant or positive states that we ever have, are temporary. They pass away. And so, at the same time, we can look at boredom, and indeed prior states that we mentioned before of stress or worry, as manifestations of the fact that life is not perfect, that looking at perfection in life is another one of these illusions that we get caught into. And indeed, oftentimes these illusions manifest themselves as a looking back or a looking forward. That is, we may, many of us do, look at the distant past as somehow perfect, and we have somehow decayed from that past. This is a perfectly embodied in the Christian mythos that has a perfect past in the Garden of Eden, from which we have somehow fallen. Another way we can have a kind of illusion of perfection is in the future. Certain kinds of social or political systems view a future in which everything is perfect, in which all problems have been solved for all eternity. This is also something that we find in religions, in Christianity as well, where we have the idea of God coming back to earth and making all things right for an eternity. From a Buddhist standpoint, particularly an early Buddhist standpoint, these are all illusions. They're the sorts of things that we grasp at and as a result feel frustrated by right now, because we aren't at these other places that are perfect, and we could be if we were only farther in the past or farther in the future. But coming from a Buddhist standpoint, there is no such thing. There is no past that was perfect. There will be no future that is perfect. The way things are is always having to do with the First Noble Truth. That is to say, that it is imperfect. Whatever perfection there is comes from our own practice and releasing our own clinging to things, releasing our clinging to a perfect future, releasing our clinging to a perfect past, releasing our clinging to a perfect present, frankly. So when we focus on this present moment, we want to focus on it with clear eyes. That is to say, not to infuse this present moment with the same kinds of illusions that we have with past and future. So we want to open our eyes and look clearly at the way things are, and understand that this present moment is also not perfect. That is to say, it's not completely satisfactory. It is most likely going to be infused with our own tendencies to cling to things, to reify ourselves, to think of ourselves as permanent beings, to think of ourselves as somehow absolutely inviolable in certain ways. And as we overcome those, we'll actually, ironically, come to a better understanding of the way things are. Which really gets to our next point, you might call it an extra point here, which is what we do with all of this. What we do with this awareness that comes to us in the present moment. Because we know that we're going to be perhaps, in this circumstance, perhaps faced with some time on our hands. Even if we're not in this circumstance of the coronavirus, we often will be left with time on our hands. Perhaps again we've lost a job or lost a relationship or something, and the question is what to do with this present moment, which is so perhaps difficult for us to endure, and in another way of looking at things, pregnant with other possibilities. And one of the ways that we can approach this is to consider ways to make ourselves better, That is to say, how can we come out of this present moment in a better place to face whatever future might hold for us? So we might consider studying, perhaps whatever it is, whatever job that we're interested in or whatever pastime we're interested in, make ourselves better at it during our off time. Perhaps we can take up some kind of exercise, physical exercise that we might not have done otherwise. Make ourselves physically healthier. Perhaps we can take up a meditation or other kinds of spiritual or Buddhist practice, which will give us, I think, a stronger psychological abilities to take on the future. Or if we need psychological help, even contacting a psychologist and undergoing or doing some kind of therapy can also be. But there's many, many different options for us as we go into the future. And if we're left at a place of stress and boredom, then think of seizing that time in the present, right now, to try to make yourself more capable to take on a better future. Perhaps just sitting down and writing out your goals is going to be enough. It's going to be enough of a spur to you to make a difference. And if so, if you think it might be, then do that right now. Do it in the present. Because one thing we can be sure of is that this present is not going to last. It's going to change. It's going to change into something else sooner than you know it. So that's the kind of mindset that we should have in order to make the best that we can right now in this stressful and at times boring life that we lead. And now I did an earlier video on the present moment and what the present moment really might be and why the present moment is really quite strange. I'll put a link to it up here on the screen. I would recommend taking a look at it if you want to learn more about this strange, weird, and important present moment. Thanks to all of you. Be healthy and safe and be well.